Hello everybody and welcome to my final video on the second season of Andor, and a lot of you have been asking me where this video is, and to be honest, I was in New York when it first aired last week. I watched it, I took notes, but I just kept thinking about it and how it tied into Rogue One and wanting to go back and watch Rogue One. So I did do that. I took notes and I started writing up this review, and then I kept thinking about, well, how does it tie into Star Wars in general? And what it really turned into was a very long meditation on this second season and these last 3 episodes in particular, but I think it deserves it because Andor really was something special, especially in the context of Star Wars. So let's break down these last 3 episodes of season 2, how I think it ties into Rogue One, how I think it ties into A New Hope, and how I think it makes the Star Wars universe in general better. We'll start with my favorite character on the show, and it was stiff competition, but it's Murrell, for which Stellan Skarsgård should get serious awards consideration, but honestly probably won't. Episode 10 finds the net closing in on Luthen, who opted to stay on Coruscant and continue to support the rebellion despite being largely excluded from it. And I love the line that Luthen gives to Kleya. I think that Stellan Skarsgård got the best lines of the series, where he acknowledges that time has pretty much run out.
Promise me if it doesn't look perfect, you won't engage.
I think we used up all the perfect.
Luthen really knows the jig is up when he meets with Lonnie, who has accessed Dedra's files and passes along the critical information that the Empire is building a Death Star, along with Galen Erso's name. As with so many other actions by so many other characters on the show, Lonnie's sacrifice, in part, leads directly to the destruction of the Death Star, and it's something that I think this show did really well when you talk about expanding the Star Wars universe. It shows how the sacrifices of characters that we didn't know and that would really be lost to history in the Star Wars world affected the rebellion, affected the outcome, how every single step along the way was critically important to what we already knew, which was the destruction of the Death Star. Now, some might say that Luthen killing Lonnie on that bench is cold-hearted, and there was definitely some calculation to this meeting, like Luthen mentioning Yavin to see what Lonnie's response was.
Where will you take us?
Yavin.
What is that?
But I think he was doing that just to see if the location of Yavin 4 was known to the Empire. I don't think that Luthen went there not sure if he was going to kill Lonnie or not, because as we talked about, he knows that it's only a matter of time before the Empire comes down. And I can tell you that any punishment that Lonnie was going to get from the Empire probably involved torture and interrogation, and then execution anyway. I don't think the idea of him escaping from Coruscant was a realistic one, and that, I think, is what Luthen really knew. He knew that there was no escape from Coruscant, so you could see his killing of Lonnie almost as an act of mercy. Luthen burns the comms console that he and Kleya used to communicate with the rebels. It's kind of fulfilling his own prophecy of burning his life from season 1. And then Dedra shows up. And this scene was a masterclass in acting from Denise Gough and Stellan Skarsgård, playing 2 characters who know exactly who the other one is and exactly why that other person is there, and are still playing the game for the last time.
There's a whole galaxy out there waiting to discuss you.
And soon you'll be telling us all about it.
And Luthen ends his own story by stabbing himself, dooming Dedra, and I think really saving the rebellion. I knew with 99% certainty that Luthen was not going to make it out of this series alive, and this last act that he took was really his last act of rebellion. It was taking the possibility away that the Empire could in any way use him to expose the rebels and where they were, and he did as much as he could do, but there was still just a little bit left to do. And that's where the attention shifted to Kleya and Elizabeth Dulau, who got this role right out of acting school. She went from a featured player to one of the stars of the show, and she's such a find as an actress. I hope that this show launches a really successful career for her. This was a great season of television, but I don't think it was an absolutely perfect one. There were a couple of things that I wish had been done better, and one of those was at least how we got told the backstory between Luthen and Kleya. I liked the basics of it, with Luthen as an Imperial officer who couldn't stand playing his part in their atrocities anymore and took on basically one of his victims, Kleya, to help him build the rebellion. We don't really see what's unfolding when we meet Luthen, but it sounds a lot like what the Empire would go on to do on Gorman and on Ferrix, and presumably on Cassian's homeworld of Kenari. The words that we hear Luthen say when we first meet him, "make it stop," would essentially become his life's motto. That's what he would do right up until the moment that he died. And I think that him finding Clea does mirror him finding Cassian and pulling them both into what would be the Rebel Alliance. He knows the value of somebody who's lost everything. But I do wish this story had been fleshed out just a little bit more. And I think that it might have been if the producers and writers of the show had known exactly what they had with Clea and Elizabeth Bilal from the very, very beginning of the series. But what we did get was great, as Clea's role became very clear. She balanced Luthen out, she was his partner in the rebellion and in business, and in many ways, she actually ran Luthen's entire operation. I mean, there's no way he could have done what he did without her. And I loved how their complementary roles were so well written. Sometimes he needed her, sometimes she needed him. And I loved the way that Luthen describes what it means to build a rebellion that won't actually pay off until years later.
We fight to win.
That means we lose. And lose and lose and lose. Until we're ready.
We witnessed basically the birth of the Rebel Alliance when Luthen and Clea bombed troops on what looked to me like Naboo. And if it was Naboo, then there is some of that poetry rhyming that George Lucas loves so much. But even in this moment, they still give Clea and Luthen a moment to talk about and reflect on exactly what they'll be losing.
You're afraid.
I'm only afraid of what I'm doing to you.
In order to finish Luthen's work, Clea has to infiltrate the medical facility where he's being kept alive, and she does it exactly as Cassian describes infiltration back in season 1.
To steal from the Empire? What do you need? A uniform, some dirty hands, and an Imperial toolkit.
And Luthen's end was not really that of a hero, or at least not what you think it would be. He died in the company of the only real connection in his life, and then was left alone in a room to be forgotten by history. It's a bittersweet ending, but it's also the only ending for this character. And I'm glad that the show left Clea alive to maintain his connection to the Alliance. Luthen's death was accompanied by Dedra's downfall, and it turns out that what was her biggest asset back in season 1, her ambition and her willingness to cross boundaries and step on toes in order to get what she wanted, was the instrument of her own destruction. Dedra's botched raid on Luthen resulted in her arrest by the Empire, suspected of being a rebel spy. And honestly, I think that she knew that she was just as done as Luthen as soon as he stabbed himself. And the rest of what we saw from her before her arrest was a desperate attempt to avoid the inevitable. We saw the Empire at its best and worst on this show, but these last 3 episodes really showed us that the Empire was already eating itself before the rebels even attacked the Death Star. I mean, this was a brutal organization because it had to be, but that applied both externally and internally. The ambition of Imperial officers took precedence over actually ruling the galaxy, as evidenced by Hirt, who went from Dedra's trusted assistant to her rival, happy to have her arrested in order to move up the ranks, and desperate to sever any of his ties with her.
It was a shift change in process, so I don't
This
think...
is Supervisor Miro's security package. I want that underlined.
Yes, sir.
And we got a great scene between Dedra and Director Krennic to bookend the one at the beginning of the season, and I was so happy to see Ben Mendelsohn really get a chance to sink his teeth into this role again.
How does one balance such passionate competency with the mindless decision to confront Luthen Rail on your own?
And yet I love that they bring in Dedra saying that one of the reasons that she had to go in and secretly get data from all over the Empire was that Krennic's squads were executing witnesses that could have been useful in finding Axis before they could get any information out of them. Once again, the appearance of strength cost the Empire actual strength. And that's best exemplified by the Death Star, their planet-killing superweapon that was going to bring quote-unquote peace to the galaxy and allow them to rule with an iron fist, was the signal flare that the rebellion needed to finally organize. I was thinking about this, and in a very interesting way, Dedra and Cyril's stories are very similar. Both of them were upwardly mobile and wanted to excel at their jobs. Both of them were ambitious and went against the orders of their superiors in order to actually find the people responsible for crimes against the Empire. And both of them were drummed out of those careers, not for incompetence necessarily, but for taking actions that backfired and potentially embarrassed other people in the chain of command. They were scapegoats to the ideology that the worst crime against the Empire is to look weak, even if punishing them actually made the Empire weaker. In many ways, they were the perfect match, but neither of them knew it until it was way too late. I wasn't really sure where Dedra was going to end up on this show, but in retrospect, her being thrown into a work prison on Narkina 5 or some similar facility was the perfect ending for her. Much better than her ending up in the Death Star or something like that, because like Cyril, Dedra was just too competent for the Empire. We saw this as well with Partagaz, who ended up taking his own life rather than face imprisonment, and the entire ISB was obviously being eaten alive by paranoia and backstabbing. I mean, the control hub where Partagaz supervised the attempt to arrest Clea was notably much emptier in this last episode than when we saw it during Mon Mothma's escape. And you could tell that Partagaz's devotion to the Empire and fealty to those above him was already weakening when he confronted Krennic about his own failures with the Death Star.
You were supposed to be ready by now.
You sound like Tarkin.
It's a miracle we've kept it quiet this long.
We're moments away.
I also love that in his last moments, Partagaz was listening to the manifesto that we saw recorded all the way back in Season 1 by Nemec, which had obviously been spreading around the galaxy.
Authority is brittle. Oppression is the mask of fear.
Just keep spreading, doesn't it?
It's been hard to contain.
In general, Andor just felt so well mapped out, and I like that they did eventually go with 2 seasons. I think that it did cost us some things, like a deeper look at Luthen and Clea, but what it also did was to tighten up the narrative and to really make those themes resonate, especially when they would call back to stuff from the previous season. Cassian comes back into play when he goes against orders to rescue Clea on Coruscant, and in many ways, he's the mirror image to Cyril and Dedra. He does everything quote-unquote wrong, he breaks the rules, he defies authority, but the rebels succeed because of it. I think that as a series, Andor is really a piece of media to point to if you're trying to find something that extols the virtues of being anti-establishment and the dangers of blind loyalty to authority. I love that before the mission, we did get a moment of levity with Cassian, K2, and Melshi. It just drove home that they were really good friends prior to Rogue One, but they were also a great team, and it was so fun seeing K2 get to absolutely wreck an entire Imperial strike team, including Hirt, who, like Karn, personally led a mission to capture a rebel, and like Karn, failed miserably. Cassian and Clea always had such an interesting relationship on the show. It would have been really easy just to have them be friends because they both worked for Luthen or worked with Luthen, but instead we see they have a bit of a rivalry.
We'll tell them together.
You told me you were done once.
Yeah, and you told me I was wrong.
The give and take between them was interesting to watch, and this is how to write good characters who are also on the same side. They don't always have to agree about everything, but they can still be allies. And after this, the action shifts to Yavin 4, which I've always said is Yavin 4, but which this show says is Yavin 4, but it's hard to break old habits. And we continue to see the growing pains of the rebellion, including a great discussion between Mon Mothma and Saw Gerrera, where he denies being on Jedha despite the fact that everyone knows he's on Jedha.
Keep hijacking these transports and that will be the least of your problems.
You have no idea where I am.
What I liked about this last episode, and some of these conversations also spill over into Rogue One, is that we see just how close the rebels came to not following through on the Death Star mission due to some of the same things that helped to bring down the Empire. The ideas of pride and trust and paranoia.
The rumors we've been hearing is that the ISB was on to Luthen. I'm afraid it's just as easy to believe that Luthen was the one being played.
Luthen's speech in Season 1 already set up that the Empire and the Rebellion share way more things than either one of them would like to admit, and I like that they followed through with that up until the very end of the series. The key difference is that the Rebellion had leaders like Bail Organa and Mon Mothma who were capable of trust and faith, and I have to say on a bit of a side note, when you look at Mon Mothma and Vel and Clea, Marva, Bix, Dedra, and others across both seasons of this show, Andor was so good at centering women without doing what Star Wars and Disney have done far too often in recent years, which is to obnoxiously toot their own horn about it and to take a victory lap. They were well-written, well-developed characters who also address things like motherhood and being a woman in a male-dominated power structure and even sexual violence in ways that seemed completely natural. They faced all of these issues, but they weren't defined by them. And I think that this is how you center strong, interesting, powerful female characters in a franchise like Star Wars without feeling the need, like Disney has done, to tell us that they are all of these things. You just write them that way. And I hope that other studios and Disney are taking notes. The last episode, episode 12, was in many ways less bombastic than you might expect from a series finale, but I think that it provided a lot of closure. I love the scene, for example, where Cassian defended Luthen to the rebel leadership.
It's insulting to hear him run down by people who have given a fraction of his sacrifice to this rebellion.
Enough!
And I thought that it was touching to see him and Vel quietly toast all of the friends that they'd lost over the last several years. I thought it also showed a lot of development to see Vel, who largely pushed characters away throughout the series, be the one to bring Kleya into the fold on Yavin, telling her that she was among friends.
I don't even really know where I am. I have friends everywhere.
The episode ends with Cassian being cleared to return to duty and being sent to the Rings of Kafrene to meet the informant Nemik, which is where we meet him in Rogue One. And as he walked to his ship, I love the glance that he shared with the Force healer that we met earlier in the season. She looks sad, as if she knows that he's taking the first steps to a necessary death. And we also get one final bittersweet moment of the show with Bix, who we see back on Murrell carrying a child, Cassian's child, who really represents the sunrise that he and Luthen and so many other rebels would never live to see. This child is a sad symbol of the life that Cassian would never get to leave, but also an uplifting reminder of just exactly what he helped to save in Rogue One. I mean, he didn't know it at the time, but of the billions of lives that he probably helped save, one of them was his own child. And perhaps most importantly, we also got confirmation that B2 did indeed survive and is just fine, which means that I won't have to start a rebellion of my own. On its own terms, Andor Season 2 was a fantastic season of television. There were just a few things that I had issues with, mainly some pacing issues. For example, those rebels back in that first batch of episodes. I know now that we tracked the Rebel Alliance throughout the season what they were supposed to represent, but I still think that could have been done just a little bit better. But outside of being a great season of television, I think that it also recontextualizes a lot of Rogue One, which I watched right after my rewatch of the last 3 episodes of the series, as I'm sure many other people did. And there were several things that stood out to me that play much differently in light of Andor. Generally, I think the movie plays even more like an ensemble piece. We learn Jyn's backstory for the first time in Rogue One, but knowing Cassian's as well gives his scenes a lot more meaning. I don't think it takes away from Jyn as much as it adds to Cassian and makes things feel more complete. Saw Gerrera comes off a bit differently with the added context of Andor. I always actually wondered why he had to take oxygen in Rogue One, but now I think this mask was actually so he could huff Rhino fumes. I mean, if you watch the movie, he actually does seem to get a little bit crazier every time he takes a hit off of that mask, and that's just a fun little bit of headcanon that you can now play with. When Jyn and Cassian are on Jedha, he tells her to be careful because Jedha City is on the verge of violence.
You seem awfully tense all of a sudden.
We have to hurry. This town is ready to blow.
Now it feels like he knows this not just out of intuition, but because he's been a witness to what's happened on Ferrix and on Gorman. He has seen multiple cities on the edge, and he knows when an uprising is about to happen, and a big conflict does happen very shortly thereafter. Chirrut's first interaction with Cassian feels a little deeper in the movie. When he tells the soldiers to let him pass, I like to think it's because he sensed the same thing as the Force healer did on Yavin 4 about Cassian and then Jyn's importance in events to come. Krennic's interactions with Tarkin and his conversation with Darth Vader also have a lot more meaning.
I'm afraid the recent security breaches have laid bare your inadequacies as a military director.
Now Tarkin and Vader aren't just upset about the delays with the Death Star and the rebel activity in the movie. We see that it's part of a string of recent failures, including the loss of Luthen and Kleya.
You do have a great many things to explain.
I delivered the weapon the Emperor requested.
And really, more than anything, I think that it makes Krennic's position in the film even more desperate than it was when the movie was self-contained. Jyn's difficulty in convincing the Alliance about the Death Star seems a lot less like a manufactured obstacle now because it's part of a pattern that we've already seen. We just saw Cassian also have trouble convincing the rebels to take action, and it makes their hesitance to join the fight on Scarif seem like a lot less of a plot convenience. When Jyn says rebellions are built on hope, we see Mon Mothma and Bail Organa exchange a little bit of a glance. And again, in my headcanon in light of the show, this is them hearing Cassian's words come out of Jyn's mouth and realizing that the message of the rebellion really is spreading outside of their inner circle. Krennic asking Jyn, "Who are you?" on Scarif also hits a lot different now that we've seen Cassian ask Karn the same question.
Who are you?
And thematically, it works because in both cases, you have a character who has played an outsized role in the life of another character, not knowing who that person is because they've had much better things and bigger things to worry about as part of a bigger organization. But most of all with Rogue One, not surprisingly, I think that all of Cassian's big moments now exist in a completely different context. From his confrontation with Jyn about the rebellion.
Suddenly the rebellion is real for you. Some of us live it. You're not the only one who lost everything.
So what do I sacrifice?
Everything!
To his big speech that kicks off the Scarif mission. In the movie, before Andor existed, it feels like a bit of an abrupt character turn, but now it feels like the culmination of his entire journey with the Rebel Alliance.
Everything we've done would have been for nothing. I couldn't face myself if I gave up now.
This was his last commitment to a cause that started on Ferrix when he met Luthen about a stolen Imperial Starpath unit, and the movie's ending hits even harder when we know exactly what Cassian is losing in that moment and what he's lost to get there. This was the realization of Luthen's dream, but the sacrifice required was, as Luthen said on Coruscant, everything. And the more I thought about Andor and Rogue One together, the more I realized that those two things also make the ending of Episode 4 even more exciting. Now, when Luke blows up the Death Star, it's not just a victory for the rebels in that moment, it is the crowning achievement, the successful completion of a plan that we have seen unfold from beginning to end. Luke is a hero, but he is no longer the hero in the destruction of the Death Star. And what Tony Gilroy and his creative team have done with this show is to add so much dimension to the Star Wars universe and make it so much more interesting. And that's what any prequel should be doing. Post Return of the Jedi in the last 40 years, I'd say that on balance, there's been more Star Wars stuff that has detracted from the overall legacy of Star Wars than has added to it. Prequel fans would say post Revenge of the Sith, which is completely fine. But what we finally got with the show was the implicit promise that Disney made when they took over Star Wars and said that they were going to start making so many new things, which is that they were going to make the universe exciting again, that they were going to bring fans back in instead of pushing them out. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that, some very valid reasons, some very dumb reasons, but I think that it's pretty clear that the Disney legacy thus far has been muddled. And even if we don't get another Andor, even if the Disney era of Star Wars ends in complete disaster, at the very least now, Star Wars fans have at least one thing to point to and say, hey, you know what? At least we got that. So those are my thoughts on the last 3 episodes of Andor, how it ties into Rogue One and how it ties into Star Wars in general. What did you think of the series overall and what it's done for the franchise? Let me know down in the comments below, and stay tuned right here on the channel if you like things like this, because I love doing reviews, talking about box office, movie news, anything having to do with entertainment. I love it. So subscribe, hit that notification so you know when I'm posting a new video. But most of all, thank you for tuning in to this video. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.